On the morning of November 14, 1987, the temperature at the Polk County Fairgrounds in Iowa was 19 degrees Fahrenheit, the kind of cold that gets into the joints of men who have worked outdoors their whole lives and reminds them without mercy of every winter they have ever survived. The parking lot was already half full by 7 in the morning. Pickup trucks mostly, a few flatbeds, men in canvas coats and wool caps standing in clusters near the entrance, breathing steam into the air, talking in the low voices that men use when they are at an auction and do not want anyone else to know what they are interested in buying. Nobody was interested in Lot 23, the 1948 John Deere Model B, sitting at the far end of the equipment line, was not the kind of a machine that drew a crowd. 2 flat tires, no battery, the green paint so far gone that in some places it was more rust than color, the kind of tractor that even the farmers who needed cheap equipment had already walked past without a second look. One man had kicked one of the flat tires on his way down the line, looked at his boot, shaken his head, and kept walking. That tractor was going to sell for nothing. Everyone at the Polk County Fairgrounds that morning understood this without discussing it. It was simply a fact of the day, like the cold, like the steam coming off the coffee in the vendor's tent near the east gate. Nobody was paying attention to the registration table at 7:45 when a girl walked up to it alone. She was small for her age, which was 14. She wore a brown wool coat that was 2 sizes too big for her, the kind of coat that had been bought for someone larger and never replaced. Her hands were covered in a pair of leather work gloves, stiff with age, the kind of gloves a man who worked with his hands would have worn every day for 20 years. Her hair was pulled back under a knit cap. She carried nothing except a small envelope, which she kept pressed against her side under her arm as she walked. She stepped up to the registration table and gave her name to the clerk, a young woman named Patricia, who had been working these auctions for 3 years and thought she had seen most things. Patricia looked at the name the girl wrote on the card. She looked at the girl. She did not ask any questions. She handed the girl a bidder's paddle. The girl took the paddle, turned, and walked into the auction yard. Her name was Clara Marsh. She was 14 years old. She had ridden the rural bus from Mitchellville alone, paying $1.45 in cash, and walked from the bus stop to the fairgrounds entrance in the cold, and she had not told anyone she was coming, not the elderly woman she lived with, not her teacher, not any of the neighbors in Mitchellville who might have recognized her and asked questions she did not want to answer. She had told the woman she lived with that she was going on a school field trip with a friend's family. That was not true. She had been planning this day for 9 months. The envelope she carried contained $340 in cash, every dollar she had earned from babysitting in Mitchellville since February 3 afternoons a week, and most Saturday evenings, 75 cents an hour, 37 straight weeks of work that she had not told anyone about either. She had kept the money in a metal cookie tin in the back of her closet and counted it 3 times in the 2 days before the auction to make sure she had not made a mistake. She had not made a mistake. $340. She did not know if it would be enough. She had asked as carefully as she could without making anyone suspicious, a retired farmer named Wendell, who lived 2 houses down from her on Maple Street, about what small old tractors went for at foreclosure auctions. Wendell had scratched his chin and said that a machine nobody wanted could go for as little as $50 if no real buyer showed up, and that a machine in poor condition with no tires and no battery might not see a serious bid at all. She had held that information in her mind for 9 months, like a compass point, like the thing she steered toward. There was a specific reason she wanted that particular tractor, but to understand the reason you have to go back to a winter that most of the men at the Polk County Fairgrounds that morning had either lived through or heard about from their fathers. You have to go back 28 years to January of 1959 and a man named Aldrich Marsh. Aldrich Marsh was born in 1918 in Polk County, Iowa. He was the son of a farmer and the grandson of a farmer, which in central Iowa in those years was not remarkable. But what Aldrich did with the land he worked was remarkable in ways that took time to become visible. He enlisted in the Army in 1942 at the age of 24 and served in the European theater, returning home in 1946 with a Bronze Star he never displayed, and a quiet that settled over him like weather and never entirely lifted. With his mustering out pay and the money he had saved before the war, he bought a farm in northeastern Polk County, 320 acres, good ground, the kind of Iowa soil that had been laid down by glaciers 10,000 years ago and had been growing things ever since. He bought equipment piece by piece as he could afford it. In 1948, he bought a John Deere Model B tractor, new, paying cash, walking out of the dealership with the keys in his hand and driving it home on the county road himself. That tractor became over the years the piece of equipment he relied on most, not because it was the newest or the most powerful, but because of what it could do that his other tractors could not. The Model B had a power takeoff configuration that allowed him to run a portable water pump from a creek or a pond, pulling water through lines that the engine heat could keep from freezing, even in extreme cold. He had rigged the system himself over 2 winters, testing it, adjusting it, until it worked exactly the way he needed it to work. I tested it in the cold because he was the kind of man who thought about what might go wrong before it went wrong. In January of 1959, what went wrong was everything at once. The ice storm that hit central Iowa on January 14th of that year was classified afterward by the National Weather Service as one of the worst freezing rain events in the recorded history of the upper Midwest. A freezing rain that began on a Thursday afternoon and did not stop for 31 hours. By the time it ended, every power line, every telephone line, every fence wire in a 6-county area was coated in 2.5 inches of solid ice. Trees split apart under the weight. Roofs caved in. Roads became sheets of ice so smooth and steep in places that no wheeled vehicle could move on them at all. The power went out across the entire region and stayed out. The temperature dropped to negative 18 degrees Fahrenheit the first night, negative 22 the second. In barns across Polk County, something was happening that the farmers who owned those barns understood immediately and could do nothing about. Cattle drink between 10 and 30 gallons of water a day, every day, regardless of the season, regardless of the weather, regardless of whether the power is out and the automatic stock tank heaters have stopped and the hand pumps have frozen solid in their housings. By the morning of January 16th, 2 days into the storm, the cattle in hundreds of barns across 6 counties were pawing at empty troughs. Aldrich Marsh was 41 years old that January. He had been up since before the storm ended, checking his animals, checking his equipment, checking the ice on the county roads with a careful eye that had learned over many winters to read what frozen ground was willing to give and what it was not. He had his own cattle to water. He had his own problems. He was one man on a farm in the middle of an ice storm with temperatures that had not risen above 0 in 3 days. He looked at his John Deere Model B. He looked at the pump rig he had spent 2 winters building. He looked at Voorhees Creek, which ran along the eastern edge of his property and had not frozen completely, even in this cold, because the water moved fast enough over the limestone bed to resist it. And then Aldrich Marsh hooked his portable pump and a 200-gallon water tank to the Model B and drove out onto the ice roads. I was not asked to do this. No one called him. There was no coordinated relief effort, no county plan, no phone tree that could have operated anyway because the telephone lines were all down. Aldrich Marsh simply understood what was happening in the barns around him and understood that he had the one piece of equipment in his part of the county that could address it, and he drove out. He spent the next 9 days driving from farm to farm, I would pump water from Voorhees Creek into the 200-gallon tank, drive to a neighbor's farm on roads so slick the tractor slid sideways into roadside ditches twice, requiring hours of handwork to free it each time, pump the water into their stock tanks, drive back to the creek, refill, drive to the next farm. He did this in temperatures that hit -22 overnight. He did it sleeping 3 to 4 hours a night in the cab of the Model B while the tank refilled, waking with ice on the inside of the windows and his breath crystallized on his collar. He saved 47 farms. He saved an estimated 3,200 head of cattle. He did it without being asked. He refused every payment that was offered to him. When a farmer's wife met him at the barn door with an envelope of cash, he handed it back and said to put it toward feed. When another farmer tried to press money into his hand at the gate, Aldrich shook his head and climbed back onto the Model B. On the 8th day, when a reporter from the Polk County Register came out to find him because word had spread in the way that word spreads in small communities, even without working phones, Aldrich told the reporter that any farmer in Polk County with the right equipment would have done the same thing. That was not true. Several farmers in the county had Model B tractors with comparable configurations. None of them did what Aldrich Marsh did. None of them drove for 9 days without stopping. None of them saved 47 farms. Aldrich was the only one who drove, and he drove because he had decided to drive, and he kept driving because there was work in front of him that was not finished. On the morning of January 18th, on day 3 of his run, Aldrich Marsh drove his Model B to a dairy farm in northeastern Polk County owned by a man named Holbrook Crandall, who everyone called Hollis. Hollis Crandall was 36 years old that morning. He had 8 head of dairy cattle in his barn, and he had been standing in front of their empty water troughs since before sunrise, watching them paw the dry floor, knowing what was coming, knowing he had no way to stop it. He had tried the hand pump 6 times through the night, frozen solid at 3 feet down. He had melted snow in a pot on the wood stove and carried it out in buckets, but you cannot water 8 dairy cattle in January with a kitchen pot and buckets. You cannot keep up. The math of it is brutal and simple, and there is no way around it. I was standing in his barn doorway at 6 in the morning, looking out at a world that was entirely white and entirely still, when he heard a sound that should not have existed, the sound of a diesel engine moving on the county road. He stood there for a moment, not believing it. Then he walked out to the road. The 1948 John Deere Model B came around the bend, with steam rising off the engine block and ice caked on the front wheels, and Aldrich Marsh sitting in the cab, his face half hidden under the brim of his work cap, his breath coming in short clouds in the cold air. The 200-gallon tank behind the tractor was almost full, the water steaming faintly in the morning freeze. Aldrich cut the engine, climbed down, looked at Hollis standing in the road. "You all right, Hollis?" Hollis Crandall, 36 years old, a grown man who had worked this farm through some hard winters and had thought of himself as the kind of man who did not break, stood in the road in front of his neighbor and felt his throat close so completely that it was 30 seconds before he could say anything at all. "I am now," he said. And he was not ashamed of the tears that came then, not on that morning, not standing in front of a man who had driven through an ice storm in -22-degree weather to bring water to his cattle. Aldrich pumped water into the Crandall stock tanks for 40 minutes. He refused breakfast. He refused coffee. He climbed back onto the Model B, looked at Hollis standing by the barn. "There are 6 more farms before lunch, Hollis. I have to keep moving." And he drove away down the ice road. Hollis Crandall stood at his gate and watched the Model B disappear around the bend. He stood there until he could no longer hear the engine. Then he went back into his barn and stood with his cattle while they drank. He never forgot that morning. Not in 34 years. Not through the good years and the hard years, and the years when the farm barely broke even. Not through the death of his first wife in 1974 or the slow climb back from that, or the second chance he had not expected. Not through all of it. The sound of that engine coming around the bend on January 18th, 1959, was the sound that Holbrook Crandall carried in his memory with more clarity than almost anything else in his life. I had attended Aldrich Marsh's funeral in the spring of 1986. He had stood at the back of the small Methodist church in Mitchellville and listened to the eulogies and had not had the right words to explain to anyone around him what he was feeling, because what he was feeling was not simply the grief of a neighbor who had lost a good man. What he was feeling was the particular weight of a debt that he had never been allowed to repay. Aldrich Marsh died owing no one, but a great many people in Polk County died owing Aldrich Marsh, and Hollis Crandall was one of them, and he had carried that knowledge for 27 years with no way to set it down. Hollis had been running auctions at the Polk County Fairgrounds since 1956. 31 years. He had stood at that podium through bankruptcies and retirements and deaths, through every variety of human loss that ends with equipment on a fairground and strangers deciding what it is worth. He was good at his job. He was fair. He moved lots efficiently and called the bids cleanly and kept things professional, which in this business meant keeping himself out of it as much as possible. I was standing at the podium at 8:55 on the morning of November 14th, 1987, running through the preliminary announcements before the bidding started, when Patricia from the registration table brought him the stack of bidder cards for the morning. He flipped through them mechanically, the way he always did, looking for anything irregular. He found it on the fourth card from the top. He stopped. He read the name on the card. He read it again. Clara Marsh. He looked up from the card. He looked out across the crowd of 200 men arranged in the auction yard in the cold November air. It took him a moment to find her. She was standing near the back, small in her oversized coat, holding her bidder's paddle in both hands at chest height, standing very still, in the way of someone who is trying not to be noticed and is not entirely succeeding. Hollis Crandall looked at that girl and felt something happen in his chest that he had not felt since he was 36 years old, standing at a gate on an ice road, watching a tractor disappear around a bend. He set the card down carefully on the podium. He picked up the microphone. The morning's auction ran through its early lots without incident. Farm equipment mostly, a set of grain augers, a baler, a working flatbed trailer that drew reasonable interest and sold for what it was worth. The crowd moved through the standard rhythms of a foreclosure sale, which are the rhythms of commerce without sentiment of value, stripped from context of things, separated from the stories of the people who use them. Lot 22 was a 1979 Farmall tractor that needed work, but had decent bones and sold for $800 to a man from the south end of the county who knew what he was looking at. Then Hollis announced Lot 23, the 1948 John Deere Model B. He described it the way the paperwork described it, sold as is, no warranties, no representations. Vance Dillard was standing in the third row from the front with two other men, both of whom sold agricultural supplies for a living and had been to enough of these auctions to know how to read a crowd. Dillard was in his early 40s, a fertilizer salesman from Ames, the kind of man whose opinions arrived before he did and stayed after he left. He looked at the Model B at the back of the equipment line. 2 flat tires, no battery, rust where the paint used to be. He laughed, not a small laugh, a broadcast laugh, the kind designed to carry. 200 for that pile of rust. You'd be doing them a favor, hauling it to the scrapyard. The men around him laughed. The laughter spread the way. Laughter spreads in a crowd of 200 people who have been standing in 19-degree air for 2 hours and are ready for something, anything to break the monotony. It spread through the rows across the bleachers until a significant portion of the yard was grinning or chuckling or exchanging glances with the private satisfaction of men who find it comfortable to agree with each other. Hollis dropped the opening to $100. Silence. He was about to drop it again when the voice came from the back of the crowd. Small, clear, steady. $100. The laughter came back louder and faster than the first time, because now there was a target for it, and the target was a 14-year-old girl in an oversized wool coat holding a bitter's paddle in her grandfather's leather gloves. Hollis held up his hand. The laughter did not stop entirely, but it dropped in volume. "Young lady," Hollis said, his voice carrying the professional distance he had maintained for 31 years at this podium, "are your parents present?" Clara Marsh looked up at him from the back of the crowd. Her face was pale in the cold. Her chin was steady. "My grandfather raised me," she said. "He passed last year. I'm here on my own." "This is a working auction," Hollis said. "Minors require a guardian to bid on." "I'm 14, sir." Her voice was quiet enough that the crowd had to stop murmuring to hear it. They stopped. "Iowa law allows a person 14 or older to enter a contract for the purchase of personal property if they can demonstrate the funds. I have the funds. They're in cash in this envelope." She held up the envelope, small, white, pressed flat from being carried under her arm. The crowd was not laughing anymore. Vance Dillard made a sound that was trying to be a laugh and not quite making it. A few men near him shifted their weight. Someone coughed. Hollis Crandall looked at the girl for a long moment. Then he looked down at the bidder card in his hand. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he has already seen, taking it in again more carefully, making sure he is not misreading what is written there. He was not misreading it. Clara Marsh. Aldrich Marsh's granddaughter. Hollis Crandall took off his glasses. He pressed the back of his hand against his eyes for a moment that lasted just long enough for the men nearest the podium to notice. Then he put his glasses back on and looked out at the auction yard with the expression of a man who has just been handed a debt he thought he would carry to his grave. He looked at Vance Dillard. "Mr. Dillard," Hollis said, and his voice was different now, quieter, with a weight in it that made the men nearby go still. "I'm going to ask you to be quiet for a moment." Dillard blinked. Hollis turned to the yard. "Most of you weren't here in 1959. Most of you don't remember. But in January of that year, this county was hit by an ice storm that took out power and roads across 6 counties. Temperature dropped to -22. The water systems froze on dozens of farms across this area, and cattle all over this county were dying of thirst in their barns. The older men in the crowd, the men in their 60s and 70s who had been there, went very still. A farmer in northeastern Polk County named Aldrich Marsh," Hollis said, "hitched a pump rig to a 1948 John Deere Model B and drove from farm to farm for 9 days straight. He pumped water from Voorhees Creek into stock tanks across this county. He saved 47 farms. He saved 3,200 head of cattle. He refused every dollar that was offered to him." Hollis paused. "He told me once when I tried to pay him that there were 6 more farms before lunch, and he had to keep moving." The yard was completely silent. A man in the 6th row had taken off his hat and was holding it against his chest without seeming to realize he had done it. 2 men near the bleachers had turned to look at each other with expressions that were past ordinary communication. "That tractor," Hollis said, "is Aldrich Marsh's tractor, the exact machine he drove for 9 days in that storm, and that young woman at the back of this yard is Aldrich Marsh's granddaughter." Emmett Graber was 66 years old. He was a farmer in northeastern Polk County. He had been 11 years old in January of 1959, and he remembered standing in his father's barn on the second morning of the storm, watching his father walk back from the hand pump for the 4th time with nothing because the line was frozen to solid ice 30 feet down. He remembered his father's face in that moment, and he remembered 2 mornings later his father walking in from the barn with an expression that Emmett had never seen on him before and has never entirely found the right word for, something between relief and something older than relief. His father had lived another 30 years. On his deathbed in the hospital in Des Moines in 1982, he had asked Emmett to make sure he understood one thing clearly, that a man named Aldrich Marsh had saved everything they had in the winter of 1959, and that a debt like that did not expire, and that if the day ever came when Emmett could do something to honor it, he should do it without hesitation. Emmett Graber had never found an occasion to do what his father asked, until now. He stood up. He took off his cap. He held it against his chest and turned to face the back of the yard where Clara Marsh was standing with her paddle held in both hands in her grandfather's gloves. My father's farm was one of the 47, Emmett said, loud enough for the yard to hear. My father told me about Aldrich Marsh from his deathbed. I would not bid against this young woman if everything I owned depended on it. A second man stood, then a third. By the time the fifth man had risen from the bleachers with his hat in his hand, the yard was as quiet as any place that contains 200 people can be. Vance Dillard stood in the third row and did not make a sound. Hollis Crandall looked out at the yard. He looked at the men standing with their caps against their chests. He looked at the 1948 John Deere Model B at the back of the equipment line with its flat tires and its missing battery and its paint gone to rust in long streaks down the hood. He looked at Clara Marsh. He brought the gavel down. Sold. Lot 23, 1948 John Deere Model B to Miss Clara Marsh of Mitchellville, Iowa, for $100. Clara lowered her paddle. She had counted the $100 out the night before, separated it from the rest of the money in the envelope, folded it once, and put it in the left pocket of her wool coat. She reached into that pocket now and walked toward the registration table. Her hands were not shaking. They had been shaking since she got off the bus that morning, but they were not shaking now. She paid. She signed the paperwork that Patricia filled out for her. She turned from the table and walked through the crowd, which parted for her in the way that crowds part for something they are not sure how to categorize, and she walked down the length of the equipment line to the far end where the Model B was parked on its flat tires in the cold morning air. She stood in front of it for a moment. Then she reached up with both hands, her grandfather's gloves still on her hands, and she took hold of the steering wheel. The cold of the metal came through the leather. It was the same cold that had come through these same gloves on January 18, 1959, when Aldrich Marsh had gripped this same wheel on a frozen road in negative 22-degree air and driven towards 6 more farms before lunch. Clara Marsh gripped the wheel and she did not let go, and she cried the way she had not let herself cry since the day she understood that the farm was gone and the man who had raised her was not coming back. She cried without covering her face. She cried in front of 200 men who 4 minutes earlier had been laughing at her. None of them were laughing now. Emmett Graber walked down to where she stood. He was a large man, hands callous from 50 years of work, a face that had been weathered into something that weather could no longer do much more to. He stood beside the tractor and waited until Clara had finished and turned to look at him. Miss Marsh, he said, my name is Emmett Graber. My father's farm was one of the 47. I've been waiting 34 years for a way to do what my father asked me to do. Clara looked at him. She did not say anything. How are you planning to get this tractor home? Emmett asked. Clara thought about the bus ticket in her other pocket, the $1.45 it had cost, the 3-hour ride from Mitchellville, the fact that she had solved the problem of buying the tractor and had not yet in 9 months of planning solved the problem of what came after. I don't know yet, she said. I'll figure it out. Emmett nodded. He turned back toward the yard where a small group of older men had begun making their way down the equipment line toward where they were standing. Clifton Bowman, Walt Deering, Harold Finch, men in their 60s who had seen Hollis stand at that podium and say the name Aldrich Marsh and had reached for their hats before they were fully aware of having done it. They gathered around the Model B and spoke quietly for a few minutes. Clara stood close enough to hear pieces of it, but not all of it. names of farms, a year, the number 9. Then Emmett turned back to her. "Miss Marsh," he said, "with your permission, we'd like to handle getting this tractor to where it needs to go. New tires, new battery, get the engine running again properly. We know men who do this kind of work, and we know where to do it. We consider it a privilege." Clara looked at the group of men standing around her grandfather's tractor in the cold November air. She looked at Emmett. She looked at Clifton Bowman, who was running his hands slowly along the fender of the Model B with an expression that had nothing to do with mechanics. "I can't pay you for that," she said. "Miss Marsh," Emmett said, "you will not pay 1 dime. That machine saved my father's herd in the winter of 1959. There is no payment large enough for that. There is only what we can do now." He looked at her steadily. "Where do you need it delivered when it's ready?" Clara thought about Winifred Alcott's small house on the edge of Mitchellville, about the narrow yard, the street parking the way the neighbors' houses came right up to the property line. "I'm staying with my great-aunt in Mitchellville," she said. "There's no room there. I don't have a place for it." Clifton Bowman spoke up. He was 52 years old, a farmer with a directness that had not been softened by decades of polite conversation. "I have a barn with empty space, 6 miles east of Mitchellville. I'll keep it there for you free of charge as long as you need. When you're old enough, you come and get it. It will be there." "Are you sure?" Clara said. "Clara," Clifton Bowman said, and it was the first time in that entire morning that anyone in the auction yard had called her by her first name alone, without formality, the way a man speaks to someone he has already decided to care about. "I am as sure as I have ever been about anything in my life." The men kept their word. Within 6 weeks working on weekends in Clifton Bowman's shop in the cold months of that winter, the 1948 John Deere Model B was mechanically restored. New tires, new battery, a rebuilt carburetor. Fresh paint matched as closely as anyone could manage to the original 1948 John Deere green. The work was done by men who had been touched by Aldrich Marsh's 9 days in 1959, either directly or through their fathers. And they did it without ceremony and without expectation of recognition, the same way Aldrich Marsh had done the thing that made their work necessary. The tractor was moved into Clifton Bowman's barn before Christmas. Clara came to see it for the first time in March of 1988. She was driven there by Winifred Alcott, who had been told the truth about the November auction only after it was over, and who had sat at her kitchen table for a long time after hearing it without saying anything, and who had then put on her coat and said that they should go. Clifton Bowman opened the barn door. The Model B stood in the clean light from the hayloft window, the green paint fresh, the tires full, the chrome on the instrument panel polished to a brightness it had not had in years. Clara walked to it. She climbed up into the cab. She sat in the driver's seat and put her hands on the wheel. Outside, Winifred Alcott stood near the barn door with her hands folded in front of her. Clifton Bowman stood beside her. Neither of them moved. For 45 minutes, Clara Marsh sat in the cab of her grandfather's tractor and did not come out. When she finally climbed down, her face was dry. She looked at Clifton Bowman. "Thank you," she said. Clifton nodded once. "It'll be here when you need it." He drove them back to Mitchellville. Neither of them said much on the drive. The fields went past the window brown and flat in the March cold, waiting for the spring that was still weeks away. Clara watched them go by. She was 14 years old. She had $100 less in her cookie tin and a grandfather's tractor sitting in a barn 6 miles away, and 320 acres of land that did not belong to her anymore, somewhere out there beyond the window. She was, without knowing it yet, already thinking about the next problem. She had learned that from Aldrich Marsh, who had looked at everything that needed doing, and then done the next thing, and then the thing after that, and who had driven away from Hollis Crandall's gate on a January morning in 1959 with 6 more farms to reach before lunch. The next thing, and then the thing after that. The first thing Clara Marsh learned about grief was that it did not announce itself on a schedule. It came when it wanted to. In the middle of a Tuesday afternoon in Winifred Alcott's kitchen, when Clara was doing homework at the table and the smell of something cooking on the stove was suddenly without warning, the exact smell of her grandfather's kitchen on a winter morning, and she had to put down her pencil and sit very still for a moment, breathing carefully, the way you breathe when you are trying to keep something from spilling. It came in the middle of the night, in the small bedroom that smelled of someone else's history, in a house that was kind to her but had not been built for her. It came on the bus to school, when the fields outside the window were the same fields she had looked at from a different window, a window that had been hers. The second thing Clara learned about grief was that it could be used, not consumed, not resolved, not defeated, used, turned in a direction, given a purpose that was larger than itself. She had figured this out more or less by the time she was 15. She could not have articulated it in those words at that age, but she understood it in the practical way that people understand things they have reached through necessity rather than theory. She had a tractor in a barn 6 miles away and land that did not belong to her anymore, and a grandfather who had spent 9 days doing something that most people would have said was impossible. And she was not going to sit in a borrowed bedroom and cry about it until someone came to fix it. Nobody was coming to fix it. That was the third thing she learned, and it was the most useful one. Winifred Alcott was 71 years old when Clara came to live with her in the fall of 1986. She was a widow. She lived in a small clapboard house on Maple Street in Mitchellville on a fixed income from her late husband's pension and a small amount of savings that had been carefully managed for years because there was no other option. She was not a cold woman. She was not unkind. She did the best she could, which in practical terms meant a warm house and regular meals and a quiet tolerance for a grieving 13-year-old who did not speak much and who sometimes sat at the kitchen table for an hour staring at nothing in particular. But Winifred was old and she was tired, and she had not planned for this. She had not planned for any of it. She had been Aldrich's wife's aunt, which made her a connection to Clara by marriage and distance and circumstance, rather than by the close weave of family that Clara had known. She was the last available relative. She had said yes when the county called because there was no one else, and because she was not the kind of woman who said no when a child needed somewhere to go. That was enough. That was a great deal, actually. Clara understood this even at 13, even in the middle of the worst year of her life. She was careful with Winifred. She did the dishes without being asked. She kept her room neat. She walked to school on days when the weather made it manageable so that Winifred did not have to warm up the car. She did not bring her grief into the common rooms of the house if she could help it. She was in the estimation of the neighbors on Maple Street, who noticed such things, a remarkably self-contained child. They did not know about the cookie tin in the back of the closet. They did not know about the 9 months of Saturday evenings and 3 afternoons a week at 75 cents an hour. They did not know about the bus ride to the fairgrounds in November, or the paddle, or the $100 counted out and folded the night before. They did not know because Clara did not tell them. She had learned in the first year after Aldrich's death that there were things you kept inside yourself, not because you were hiding them, but because they were too important to risk. If she had told someone about the plan, they might have told her it was impossible. They might have said she was too young, that she didn't understand how these things worked, that a 14-year-old girl could not walk into a foreclosure auction alone and bid on a piece of equipment. They might have been kind about it. They might have been right about parts of it, but she would not have known until she tried, and she had not wanted anyone's doubt inside her plan before she tried. So she kept it to herself, and she tried, and it worked. In February of 1988, 3 months after the auction, Clara turned 15. Winifred made a small cake and invited Wendell from 2 houses down, who was 81 and deaf in one ear, and who told a story about a birthday party in 1934 that nobody could entirely follow, but which everyone appreciated. It was a good evening. Clara was grateful for it. She went to bed that night and lay in the dark in the room that smelled of someone else's life and made a list in her head of what she knew and what she did not know, and what the distance was between where she was and where she needed to get to. What she knew, the land was gone. 320 acres that had been in the Marsh family since Aldrich bought it after the war. An investment group out of Des Moines had purchased it at the foreclosure auction in early 1988, after the equipment had been sold and the estate settled and the bank's debt cleared. They had bought it because they bought things like it, not to farm, to hold, to wait for values to move in a direction that made selling profitable. What she did not know whether it would ever come back. What she understood lying in the dark at 15, the distance between those 2 points was not a single step. It was a road, a long road, the kind you walk without knowing the exact destination until you are close enough to see it clearly. You do not drive that kind of road in a single morning. You drive it the way her grandfather had driven 9 days of ice, one farm at a time, and then the next one, and then the one after that. She started with school. She was a serious student, the kind who does not make a performance of seriousness, but simply works steadily, without drama, taking each subject as a problem to be solved, and solving it with the same methodical attention she had brought to the cookie tin and the 37 weeks of babysitting. By the time she reached her junior year at Mitchellville High, she was at the top of her class in science and mathematics, solid in English, and had developed a particular interest in agricultural economics that her teacher, a woman named Mrs. Hargrove, who had grown up on a farm in Boone County, recognized and quietly encouraged. Mrs. Hargrove was the one who told Clara about the Iowa State University Agricultural Scholarship Program. She mentioned it in October of Clara's junior year, setting a pamphlet on Clara's desk after class without comment, the way a good teacher places something in front of a student and lets the student decide what to do with it. Clara read the pamphlet that night. She filled out the application over the following 3 weekends. She wrote the required essay about why she wanted to study agriculture. She did not write about the auction or the tractor or the $100. She wrote about her grandfather and about 320 acres of Iowa topsoil that had been farmed continuously since 1946, and about what it meant to understand the land. You worked at a level that went below technique and into something older. She mailed the application herself. She did not tell Winifred until the acceptance letter came in April of 1991. Winifred read the letter twice sitting at the kitchen table, and then she looked up at Clara with an expression that Clara had not seen on her face before, something complicated, pride and relief, and something underneath those things that Clara later understood was the particular emotion of someone who has done their best with a situation that was too large for them and has found out after years of uncertainty that it was somehow enough. Your grandfather would have liked this, Winifred said. I know, Clara said. She arrived at Iowa State in the fall of 1991. Scholarship covered tuition. She worked. She had been working since she was 13 in one form or another, and she did not stop now. She waitressed at a diner near campus on weekends. She filed papers at the Agricultural Extension Office on campus 2 afternoons a week. She lived simply in a manner that would have looked like deprivation to her classmates if any of them had paid close enough attention, but none of them did, because Clara was not the kind of person who made her circumstances visible unless she chose to. She chose as she had always chosen not to. She studied agricultural science with the focus of someone who is not studying for a grade or a career in the abstract sense, but for a specific purpose that is waiting at the end of the road. She took every course she could find on soil management, crop rotation, sustainable farming practices, land valuation, agricultural finance. She stayed after class to ask questions that went further than the curriculum. She read papers and journals that no one assigned her to read. She developed, by her junior year, a detailed and practical understanding of what it would take to bring a medium-sized Iowa farm back to full productivity after a period of tenant farming and institutional ownership. 320 acres, in her mind always 320 acres, and in Clifton Bowman's barn, 6 miles east of Mitchellville, the 1948 John Deere Model B sat on its new tires in the clean air of a well-kept barn and waited. Clara visited it, not as often as she would have liked, because she did not always have the time or the transportation, but she visited. In the summer after her freshman year, she drove out to Clifton's farm 3 times in the old Buick she had bought for $400 from a retiring neighbor of Winifred's. She would park in Clifton's drive walk to the barn, open the door, and stand for a moment in the light that came through the hayloft window. The tractor looked exactly as it had looked when she first saw it restored. Clifton kept it that way. He ran the engine periodically to keep the cylinders from seizing. He checked the tires and the fluid levels and kept the barn dry and tight against the weather. He did this without comment, without documentation, without any expectation that anyone would acknowledge it. Clara acknowledged it. Every time she came, she found Clifton somewhere on his property, in the shop or the field or the farmyard, and she thanked him. And every time Clifton said the same thing, "It'll be here when you need it." In the summer of 1993, between her junior and senior years at Iowa State, Clara drove the old Buick down the county road that ran past the eastern edge of what had been her grandfather's land. She had driven this road before. She drove it deliberately, not by accident, because she had learned that avoiding things you need to face is not the same as being strong, and that you have to be able to look at what you have lost without losing yourself in the looking. She slowed the car as she passed the property line. The fields were planted. Corn, mostly with soybeans on the eastern quarter. Good corn, straight rows, proper spacing, healthy color in the late June heat. The investment group had been leasing the land to a tenant farmer for 5 years, and the tenant farmer knew his business. The land looked fine, better than fine. The land looked like what it had always been, some of the best topsoil in Polk County, black and deep and extraordinarily patient, willing to grow whatever was asked of it and to keep growing it for as long as anyone cared to farm it. Clara pulled over and stopped the car. She sat with the engine off and the window down and looked at those fields for a long time. The corn moved a little in the afternoon wind. The sky above it was the particular blue of an Iowa summer, deep and clear, the kind of sky that makes you understand why people farm this land generation after generation, even when the economics make no clear sense, and the weather is merciless and the margins are thin as paper. Aldrich Marsh had looked at this same sky every summer of his adult life. Clara sat at the edge of the road for 20 minutes. Then she started the car and drove back to Ames. She was 20 years old. She had at that point $4,300 in a savings account at a bank in Ames. She added to it every month automatically before she paid any other bill, the way her grandfather had approached every problem that required sustained effort, by deciding what the commitment was and then making it quietly and without wavering and letting the accumulation take care of itself. She graduated from Iowa State in May of 1994 with a degree in agricultural science and a focus in land management. She took a job at the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship in Des Moines, entry-level, doing land use analysis and writing reports on soil conservation programs. The pay was not remarkable, but it was steady, and it came with benefits, and it put her inside the world of Iowa agriculture at a level that allowed her to understand things that her coursework had only approximated. She rented a small apartment in Des Moines. She continued to save. By the end of 1994, she had $14,000, By the spring of 1995, 19,000, it was not enough. She knew it was not enough. She had known for years that $19,000 was not enough to buy 320 acres of central Iowa farmland, and she had known for years that she was going to have to solve the problem of the gap between what she had and what the land would cost in some way that was not simply a matter of saving longer. She had been thinking about the shape of that solution for a long time. The spring of 1995 was when the investment group out of Des Moines put Aldrich Marsh's land on the market. Clara heard about it through a contact at the Department of Agriculture, a land records clerk named Russell who processed agricultural property transfers and who had learned over the 18 months Clara had worked in the building that she was interested in a specific parcel in Polk County and would appreciate knowing if anything changed about its status. Russell left a note on her desk on a Thursday afternoon in March. The asking price was $640,000. Clara looked at the number for a long time. Then she got in her car and drove to Clifton Bowman's farm. It was a Saturday. Early March, the ground still frozen, the fields bare and gray under a sky that had not decided yet whether it was done with winter. Clifton was in his shop working on a piece of tillage equipment when she pulled into the drive. He looked up when she came in, took in her expression, and set down the wrench he was holding. "Coffee," he said. They went into the kitchen. Clifton poured 2 cups from a pot that had been on the burner for several hours and was past the point most people would have considered drinkable, which was exactly the kind of coffee Clara had come to associate with Clifton's kitchen and which she had learned to drink without comment. She told him about the listing. She told him about the price. She told him about the $19,000. She said what she had not said out loud to anyone since she had started thinking it 3 years ago in a diner near the Iowa State campus at 11:30 at night with a cup of coffee and a napkin she had covered with numbers. She said, "Cliff, how many of the farms that my grandfather helped in 1959 are still operating?" Clifton Bowman put down his coffee cup. He looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man who has been waiting for a question and is taking a moment to make sure before he answers it that the moment is exactly what it appears to be. Then he stood up and walked to the desk in the corner of the kitchen. He opened the second drawer from the top. He took out a piece of paper folded in quarters that was soft with age and had been refolded along its creases so many times that the paper had grown thin at the fold lines. I brought it back to the table and set it in front of Clara. She unfolded it. It was a list, handwritten in a careful, even script in ink that had faded from black to a dark brown over the decades. At the top, in the same careful hand, January 1960. Below that, a column of names, farm names and family names, addresses, and next to each entry in pencil notations in different shades of gray that told their own quiet story of years and updates and the slow passage of everything. 31 entries, 31 farms still operating as of the last notation Clara could find, which appeared to be from 1994. She looked up at Clifton. "I've kept that list since 1960, he said. "I update it every year. I call around. I drive past. I check the county records." He paused. "I don't know why I started doing it. I just did. And I didn't stop." Clara looked back at the list. "Cliff," she said, "I have a plan." She had been calling it a plan in her own mind for months. What it actually was, as she spread it out on Clifton Bowman's kitchen table that March afternoon, was 11 pages of single-spaced, typewritten text covering every aspect of a proposed partnership agreement between Clara Marsh and a consortium of investor partners drawn from the farming community of Polk County. She had spent 6 months writing it. The structure was straightforward. The consortium would contribute the capital to purchase the 320 acres at the asking price of $640,000. Clara would farm the land using sustainable practices designed to minimize input costs and maintain or improve soil quality. Revenue from the farming operation would be split 60% to the investors and 40% to Clara for the first 10 years, then reversed 40% to the investors and 60% to Clara for the following 5 years. At the end of year 15, Clara would have the right to buy out all consortium interests at fair market value minus 20% in recognition of the 15 years of land stewardship she would have provided. It was not charity. It was not a gift. It was a business proposition structured to protect the investor's capital while giving Clara a path to ownership that did not require her to begin with money she did not have. She had run the numbers every way she could think of: conservative yield projections, pessimistic commodity price assumptions. She had built in a loss reserve for bad crop years. The math worked, not easily, not with any margin that would allow for carelessness, but it worked. Clifton read all 11 pages. He read them slowly without speaking, turning each page with the care of a man who does not skim over things that matter. When he finished, he set the last page down on the stack and looked at the wall behind Clara's head for a moment. Then he picked up the phone. Within 2 weeks, 12 farmers had committed. Within 4 weeks, the consortium had pooled $640,000 in cash, not pledge, not promise, deposited into an escrow account at a bank in Des Moines in full, ready to move. What Clara did not know while this was happening was that the investment group had received another offer. A company out of Omaha that operated several thousand acres of industrial corn production across Iowa and Nebraska had submitted a cash offer $20,000 above the asking price. Their acquisition manager had visited the property in February and had assessed it as a good addition to their existing operational footprint. The paperwork was straightforward. The company was well capitalized. From a purely financial perspective, the investment group's attorney was recommending acceptance. The decision landed on the desk of a man named Randall Briggs, who was the managing partner of the investment group. Briggs had grown up in Kossuth County in northern Iowa, 2 counties removed from Polk. His father had farmed, not one of the 47. His father had not been reached by Aldrich Marsh's 9-day run because his farm was out of the range that a single man with a 200-gallon tank could cover, but his father had known the story. In farming communities in Iowa in the 1960s and 1970s, the story of Aldrich Marsh and the winter of 1959 was not ancient history. It was the kind of story that fathers told sons when they were trying to explain something about what kind of man a person ought to be. Not a lecture, just a story told at the right moment in the way that stories are told when the teller wants the listener to carry it without knowing they are being asked to carry something. Randall Briggs's father had told him that story on a November evening in 1971 when Randall was 12 years old, sitting at the kitchen table after supper. He could not have told you now at 55 what had prompted his father to tell it that particular evening, but he remembered the story. He remembered the name. When Clifton Bowman called the investment group's office to introduce the consortium offer, Briggs took the call himself. He listened to the terms. He asked Clifton to explain briefly who the farming partner would be. Clifton said the name, Clara Marsh, Aldrich Marsh's granddaughter. Briggs asked Clifton to hold. He put down the phone and sat at his desk in the quiet of his office for approximately 2 minutes, looking at nothing in particular. Then he picked up the phone and said, "We'll take the consortium offer." His attorney spent 30 minutes explaining why this was financially inadvisable. Briggs listened to all of it. When the attorney finished, Briggs said, "Draw up the papers. The Omaha offer is $20,000 higher, Randall." "I know what it is," Briggs said. "Draw up the papers." He did not explain further. He did not tell his attorney about a November evening in 1971 or a father's voice telling a story about a man driving a tractor through an ice storm in negative 22-degree air. Some things do not require explanation to the right audience, and some things cannot be explained to the wrong one, and Briggs understood the difference. The papers were drawn up, the offer was submitted, the investment group signed, the sale was scheduled for closing on June 14, 95. Clara received the call from the escrow attorney on a Tuesday morning in early June while she was at her desk at the Department of Agriculture. She sat very still after she hung up the phone. The office around her continued at its normal pace, people moving between desks, phones ringing, the sound of the coffee machine in the break room down the hall. None of it registered. 320 acres, sold. She called Clifton Bowman from a payphone in the building lobby. He said, June 14th. June 14th, Clara said. I'll call the others, Clifton said. On the morning of June 14th, 1995, Clara Marsh drove from her apartment in Des Moines to Clifton Bowman's farm. She was 22 years old. She had $19,000 in her savings account and a degree in agricultural science and a job she was about to resign from, and she was about to sign papers that would return to her family something that should never have left it. She stopped the car at the end of Clifton's drive and sat for a moment. Then she looked east across the flat fields toward the part of Polk County where her grandfather's land lay waiting. The corn was already a foot high in the June warmth. The sky was the deep blue of an Iowa summer, the same sky Aldrich had worked under for 40 years. She got out of the car and walked to the house. Clifton's kitchen was crowded in the way of a room not designed for 12 people. The men who had committed their capital and their faith to this arrangement were standing in the spaces between the table and the counter, and the doormen in their 60s and 70s in work clothes, men who had driven here from their own farms on a Saturday morning because this was the kind of thing you showed up for in person. Emmett Graber was there, Walt Deering, Harold Finch, 9 others whose names Clara had learned over the months of meetings and phone calls and the slow accumulation of trust that comes from showing people a plan and letting them find the edges of it and ask the hard questions and then showing them that you had already thought about the hard questions. The closing attorney had driven out from Des Moines and set his briefcase on Clifton's kitchen table and organized the paperwork into the stacks that needed to be signed in a particular order. Clara sat down at the table. The room was quiet in the way of a room where everyone present understands the weight of what is about to happen. She picked up the pen. She signed the first document, then the second, then the pages that followed the legal infrastructure of a transaction that was at its core not a transaction at all, but a restoration. The slow, deliberate 11-page plan and 15-year path into generations' return of something that had been taken from a family that could not defend itself against the simple arithmetic of a dead man's debt, and a bank that was owed money, and a legal system that moves at the speed it moves. She signed the last page. The closing attorney collected the documents. He confirmed the wire transfer. He shook hands with the consortium members and with Clara, and said the things closing attorneys say, which are professional and correct, and which land in the room without weight, because everything that matters has already happened in the moment. The pen moved across the line. Emmett Graber, who had stood up first in the auction yard 8 years ago with his hat against his chest, was sitting in the corner near the window. He was 74 years old now. His hair was entirely white. His hands on the table were the hands of a man who had worked land his entire life and would work it until he could not. I was not crying. He was simply sitting very still, looking at Clara with the expression of a man who has carried something for a very long time and has just been allowed finally to set it down. Clifton Bowman poured coffee. The men in the room began to talk quietly, the way men talk when something significant has happened, and they are not entirely sure yet how to characterize it. They talked about the weather and the planting season, and the price of corn, and the practical questions of what equipment Clara would need for the first season and who might have something she could borrow. Clara sat at the table and listened and drank her coffee. Outside, through the kitchen window, the June fields stretched east toward the land that now, in the language of legal documents and property records and the straightforward arithmetic of signed papers, belonged to the Marsh family again. In 8.5 years, it would be paid off, the consortium made whole, the last installment settled, 1 year ahead of schedule as it turned out. But that was a future problem. Clara was good at future problems. For now, she sat in a crowded kitchen with 12 old men who had kept a tractor for 8 years and signed papers on faith and driven to a farmhouse on a Saturday morning because a girl's grandfather had once said there were 6 more farms before lunch, and had kept driving, and she drank her coffee, and she let herself be for just this one morning exactly where she was. The first morning Clara Marsh drove her grandfather's tractor across her grandfather's land, she did not tell anyone she was going to do it. It was a Tuesday in early April of 1996. The ground had thawed enough the week before to take the weight of equipment without compacting, which Clara had tested by walking the fields herself on a Sunday afternoon, pressing her heel into the soil every 20 yards and reading what the earth told her, the way Aldrich had taught her to read it when she was young enough that she had to reach up to take his hand while they walked. The soil was ready. The season was ready. She drove out to the farm before sunrise. The farmhouse was still in rough shape. She had spent the winter living in it anyway, because she was not the kind of person who waits for conditions to be ideal before beginning, and because there was something important to her about being on the land through its first winter back in the family, even if that meant a drafty kitchen and a furnace that needed coaxing every morning and a bedroom ceiling that had developed a water stain in the shape of something that might have been the state of Illinois. She had fixed what she could fix herself. She had added the rest to a list. She had a lot of lists. She walked out to the equipment shed in the gray pre-dawn light. Clifton Bowman had helped her move the Model B from his barn in March, trailering it the 6 miles to the farm on a cold Saturday morning, with 2 of the other consortium men following in their own trucks, a small procession that nobody had organized, but that had assembled itself naturally, the way things assemble when the people involved understand without discussion what is being marked. The tractor sat in the equipment shed alongside the borrowed machinery she had arranged for the first season, a planter, a grain drill, a cultivator, all of it older equipment lent by consortium members who had more than they needed and who had offered without being asked. The Model B was the smallest machine in the shed and the oldest, and the one that was not, strictly speaking, necessary for the work of the season. But Clara started it first. She climbed into the cab in the dark. The seat was cold. She sat for a moment with her hands on her knees, looking through the windshield at the inside of the equipment shed, at the tools hanging on the wall, and the shape of the borrowed machinery in the shadows. Then she set her hands on the wheel. She turned the key. The engine caught on the second try, which was better than she had expected for an April morning, and she felt the machine come alive beneath her the way machines that are properly maintained do, not with a struggle, but with a kind of inevitability, as if this was simply what it had been waiting to do. She let it warm up. She sat in the cold cab with the engine running and listened to it, and the sound of it in the enclosed shed was the same sound it had made in Clifton's barn all those years, the same sound it had made on ice roads in January of 1959. She pulled out of the shed as the first light was coming up in the east. She drove the tractor slowly around the perimeter of the home quarter, 160 acres the piece, that contained the house and the outbuildings and the ground closest to the road. She drove it at a speed that was not the speed of working, but the speed of looking, the slow pace of a person who wants to see every foot of something clearly. The wheels moved through the soft spring ground and left tracks that filled slowly with water as the light grew stronger and the sky moved from gray to the pale, clear color that Iowa skies find on good April mornings before the warmth of the day comes on. She completed the circuit without stopping. Then she went back to the shed, switched to the planter, and went to work. The first crop year was corn and soybeans on a rotation schedule Clara had designed through the winter, drawing on everything she had learned at Iowa State and everything she had read since, and the specific knowledge of this particular soil that she had been accumulating since childhood. She was not reinventing what Aldrich had done. She was continuing it, adjusting it for what she now understood that he had not had the training to articulate, but had practiced instinctively. The deep relationship between a farmer and a specific piece of ground that develops only over decades and that cannot be purchased or transferred but must be lived. She farmed alone that first year mostly. Emmett Graber came out in June to help with a cultivation problem she had not anticipated arriving without being called, because he had driven past the field on his way to town and seen from the road what needed doing. He spent 4 hours in the heat with her and drove home without eating lunch. Walt Deering lent her a grain cart in August that she would not have been able to afford to rent. Clifton Bowman called every 2 weeks to ask a single question about how the season was going, which was his way of asking whether she needed anything, and Clara's answer, delivered in the same tone each time, was her way of saying that she was all right, but appreciated the question. The crop came in that fall, not a record year, not a disaster, a solid workmanlike first year on land that had been farmed by a tenant for 7 years and was now being farmed by someone who intended to stay. The soil knew the difference, Clara believed, though she would not have said so to anyone who might have questioned it. The soil always knows whether the person farming it is passing through or staying. She was staying. The years that followed settled into the rhythm of farming life, which from the outside looks repetitive and from the inside is never the same twice. Each season brought its own specific challenges. A wet spring in 1998 that delayed planting by 3 weeks and required her to make decisions about variety selection that she had not planned for. A drought in 2000 that took 20% off her yields and required her to draw on the loss reserve she had built into the partnership agreement, which was there for exactly this reason, and which she was grateful for, and which she paid back into the reserve fund over the following 2 years. A period in 2003 and 2004 when commodity prices compressed her margins to a width that required her to look carefully at every input cost and make decisions about what was essential and what was not. She made the decisions. She kept the operation solvent. She did not miss a distribution to the consortium. Not once. Not in 15 years. Holbrook Crandall died in the spring of 2003. He was 80 years old. Clara heard the news on a Friday evening from Clifton, who called to tell her because he thought she would want to know before she read it in the paper. She sat for a while after the call in her kitchen, which she had repaired and repainted over the winter, and which now looked something like a room rather than the shell of one. The spring light was still in the western windows. She could hear the equipment shed from where she sat, the small sounds a building makes when the day is cooling and the metal is contracting. She thought about Hollis Crandall standing at his podium on a November morning in 1987, looking at a bidder card with her name on it, taking his glasses off. She thought about his voice when he spoke to the yard, the weight that had come into it, the 28 years he had been carrying without being able to set it down. She thought about what it means to be the kind of man who remembers a debt for 28 years and is still looking for the way to repay it when the chance finally comes. The funeral was on a Saturday. Clara drove to Mitchellville, put on the clothes she kept for occasions that required them, and drove to the church. It was a good-sized funeral. Hollis Crandall had been a known figure in Polk County for more than 3 decades, and the people who came to say goodbye filled the church and spilled into the vestibule. Clara sat in a pew near the back and listened to the eulogies. They were good eulogies. They captured a man who was fair and capable and present in his community in ways that mattered. They captured most of him. Afterward, in the churchyard, she drove the Model B. She had trailered it from the farm that morning, not sure until she was loading it whether she was actually going to do what she was thinking about doing, and then deciding, with the logic she had developed for these kinds of decisions over the years, that the question was simply whether it was the right thing and not whether it was a comfortable thing or a conventional thing or a thing that would not attract attention. It was the right thing. So she did it. She parked the Model B at the edge of the cemetery lot during the graveside service. She could see it from where she stood. She thought some of the people around her could see it too, though no one said anything during the service itself. Afterward, Emmett Graber walked up to her. He was 82 now, slower than he had been, and he used a cane on uneven ground, but his handshake was still the handshake of a working farmer, and his eyes were still the eyes of a man who paid attention. Hollis would have liked that, Emmett said, nodding toward the tractor at the edge of the lot. I know, Clara said. Emmett looked at her for a moment, and then he looked at the Model B, and she saw in his face the same thing she had seen in that auction yard 15 years ago, the look of a man in the presence of a debt being properly honored, and she understood that for Emmett this moment was something like completion, though neither of them would have used a word that large for it. How's the land? He asked. Good, she said. It's good, Emmett. He nodded. They stood together for a moment in the spring sunlight in the cemetery, and then Emmett said he had to get back to his farm, and Clara said she needed to get the tractor loaded, and they shook hands and went in their separate directions. The work continued. The years between the first crop and the buyout year were the years in which Clara Marsh became a farmer in the full sense of the word, which is a different thing from being a person who farms. The difference is invisible from the outside and unmistakable from the inside. It is the difference between managing a piece of land and knowing it, between applying techniques and understanding why they work on this particular soil, in this particular climate, with this particular water table, between making decisions based on general principles and making decisions based on an accumulated body of specific knowledge that has no textbook equivalent. She expanded carefully. In the early years of the consortium agreement, she added no acreage because the priority was demonstrating to her partners that the original plan was viable and that their capital was being stewarded responsibly. She built soil health. She invested in drainage tile on the low ground along the western edge of the property, which reduced her yield losses in wet years and allowed her to plant earlier in springs, like the one in 1998. She maintained the equipment she had borrowed until she could afford to buy her own, and she bought carefully, the way Aldrich had bought, the way men who understand that equipment is a tool and not a statement tend to buy. By 2005, the operation was producing at a level that exceeded her original projections by 14% on a 3-year average. This was not luck. It was the compounded result of years of decisions that had each been made correctly or close enough to correctly that the errors did not accumulate into problems. She submitted her financial reports to the consortium, every quarter detailed and transparent, the same whether the numbers were good or difficult. Several of the consortium members had told her at various points over the years that they had stopped reading the reports carefully because they trusted her and did not need the detail. She continued to provide the detail anyway because the agreement required it, and because an agreement means exactly what it says and not what is convenient. Vance Dillard, the fertilizer salesman from Ames, who had laughed first in the auction yard in November of 1987, retired from his sales job in 1998 and moved to Scottsdale, Arizona. Clara heard about this from no one in particular. It was the kind of information that circulates in a county without anyone specifically distributing it. She did not think about Vance Dillard often. She thought about him occasionally in the way that you think occasionally about a thing that illustrated something without meaning to. He had not known standing in that auction yard what he was laughing at. That was not cruelty. That was ignorance of a specific history, the kind of ignorance that is nobody's fault and everybody's responsibility to remedy when the information arrives. The information had arrived for Vance Dillard in that auction yard the same as for everyone else. What a person does with information after it arrives is the only thing that tells you anything worth knowing about them. Clara did not know exactly when Vance Dillard died. She heard about it afterward, sometime in the fall of 2011, from Clifton, who had seen a small notice in a regional paper, Scottsdale, Arizona, July of that year, 76 years old. The obituary, Clifton said, was 3 lines. Clara nodded when Clifton told her. She did not say anything unkind about Vance Dillard, and she did not say anything kind about him either, because she did not know him and had not known him, and the story of his life was his own story and not hers to assess. She simply registered the information and set it beside the other information she carried about that November morning, where it found its place in the larger picture, the way a piece of a puzzle finds its place, quietly and without drama, filling a space that had been waiting for it. The buyout came in the summer of 2009. Clara had been running the numbers since the beginning of 2008, watching the projections converge on a date that was slightly ahead of the contracted schedule. By the end of 2008, she was certain. By March of 2009, she had called the consortium's designated attorney and initiated the buyout process. The paperwork took 3 months. Year 15 of the agreement was 2010. Clara completed the buyout in September of 2009, 14 years and 3 months after the papers had been signed in Clifton Bowman's kitchen, 1 year ahead of schedule. She sent each consortium member a certified check for their final disbursement, calculated exactly according to the terms of the original agreement. Fair market value, independently assessed by an agricultural land appraiser, minus 20%, exactly as the contract specified. Every dollar accounted for, every obligation fulfilled. 3 of the checks came back. Emmett Graber sent his back with a note written in the careful hand of a man whose handwriting had gotten slower and more deliberate as he aged. The note said, "I watched you bring it back. That's my payment. Don't send this again." Walt Deering simply mailed the check back without a note. Clara called him. He said without elaborate explanation that he was comfortable and did not need it, and that the land looked good from the road. Then he said goodbye and hung up. Clifton Bowman kept his check for 2 weeks, which Clara thought meant he was going to cash it. Then it came back in an envelope with a photograph inside. The photograph was from March of 1988, taken by someone she did not remember being there, showing Clara at 16 climbing up into the cab of the freshly restored Model B in Clifton's barn, her grandfather's gloves on her hands, the hayloft light coming through the window above her. On the back of the photograph, in Clifton's handwriting, "I've been holding on to this. Thought you should have it. Keep the check." Clara held the photograph for a long time at her kitchen table. Then she called Clifton and told him she was going to deposit his check into a scholarship fund she was establishing at the Polk County 4-H for young people interested in agricultural careers in his name, and that she expected him not to argue about it. Clifton was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's fine, Clara." She pressed him on the other 2 checks as well, over several phone calls, and eventually all 3 uncashed amounts found their way into the scholarship fund, attributed to the men who had refused the payments, their names on something that would carry their connection to this land forward into the future, the way connections to land in Iowa have always been carried through the work of the next generation and the one after that. She farms the land today. She is 53 years old. The farmhouse is not the same house it was in 1996 because she has repaired and renovated it over the years as the operation generated the resources to do so, but it is recognizably the same house, the same structure, in the same place with the same view, east and west, across the fields, that Aldrich Marsh looked at every morning of his working life. The equipment shed has been expanded twice. The drainage tile has been extended. The soil health metrics, which Clara tracks with more precision than most operations her size, show a consistent improvement in organic matter and water retention over the 15 years since she took over from the tenant farming years, which is the trajectory that good stewardship produces on good ground when a person is paying attention. She expanded in 2014. The farm to the north of her original parcel belonged to a man named Orville Pittman, who had farmed it since the 1970s and who retired at 78 after a winter that made him certain he had pushed his body about as far as it was willing to go. Orville sold to Clara because he wanted it to go to someone who would farm it and not someone who would hold it, and because she was the one who showed up at his kitchen table with an offer and a plan and the kind of quiet certainty that tells an old farmer more than any financial statement can. 160 additional acres, 480 total. She planted that first spring on the new ground with the same attention she had given every first season, walking every field, pressing her heel into the soil, reading what was there. The Pittman ground was good, but had been farmed conventionally for 40 years and would take some time to come back to full expression. That was all right. She had time. She had learned from the example of the most important education of her life that time is not an obstacle to the thing you are committed to. It is the medium in which the thing you are committed to becomes real. Emmett Graber died in February of 2017. He was 96 years old, which was as long as a man who works land as hard as Emmett had worked his had any right to expect, and perhaps a few years longer, which suggested that he had simply decided on a schedule and kept to it. Clara drove to the funeral. She sat near the front this time. She had earned the front, and she knew it, and she sat there without apology. There were grandchildren at the funeral, and great-grandchildren, and farmers who had known Emmett for decades, and the church was full in the way of funerals for men who lived long and worked honestly and stayed where they were planted. At the graveside, someone who introduced himself as Emmett's grandson asked Clara how she had known his grandfather. She told him, not the short version, the real version, the one that started in November of 1987 and went back to January of 1959 and moved forward through 30 years of a community keeping a promise to a dead man by keeping it to his granddaughter. She told it in the way it deserved to be told, in the cold air of an Iowa February, at the graveside of a man who had stood up first when standing up mattered. The grandson listened to all of it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. I didn't know all of that, he said. Most people don't, Clara said. That's why it has to be told. Clifton Bowman is 91 years old. Has been in an assisted living facility in Des Moines for 3 years, since a fall in his kitchen in 2023 made it clear that the farmhouse was no longer a safe place for a man living alone. He adapted to the new arrangement with the same practical equanimity with which he had adapted to everything else in a life that had not been short on things requiring adaptation. He keeps a photograph of his farm on the dresser in his room and a photograph of the Model B on the wall beside the window. Clara visits him twice a month. She brings photographs of the crops printed on a small printer she bought specifically for this purpose, because Clifton's eyesight does not allow him to see screens well, and because there is something different about a photograph you can hold. She brings a thermos of coffee from her kitchen, the kind of coffee that has been on the burner for a while, because this is what Clifton's kitchen always produced, and she has decided it is important to maintain continuity in certain things. They talk about the land. They talk about what she is planning for the next season and what the soil tests are showing and what the corn market is doing. They talk sometimes about the men who are gone. Emmett, Walt Deering, who died in 2014 at 88, still farming up until the last spring. Harold Finch, who sold his farm in 2018 and died the following year, which was not, Clara suspected, a coincidence, because some men are so connected to their land that the separation is its own kind of ending. On a visit last October, Clifton held her hand for a long time without speaking. This was new. Clifton had not been a man who held hands in Clara's experience of him. He had been a man who showed up and stayed and kept the tractor running and had a list in his desk drawer that he updated every year for 34 years without being asked. But he was 91 now, and things that had been stored found their way out. After a while he said, "I kept that tractor for 8 years, Clara." "I know you did," she said. "8 years," he said again. "I ran the engine to keep the cylinders from seizing. I checked the tires every month. I kept the roof tight so the weather wouldn't get in." He was quiet for a moment. "Those were the proudest 8 years of my life." Clara kept hold of his hand. Outside the window of his room, the Des Moines skyline was gray in the October light, the way October light in Iowa sits on things without warmth but without malice, either a clear and honest light that shows what is there. She looked at Clifton's face, which was the face of a man who was very old and very tired and very much at peace, and she thought about what it means to have lived a life in which the thing you are proudest of is 8 years of keeping a promise to a girl whose grandfather saved 47 farms. She thought about what Aldrich Marsh would have made of all of it. The auction, the consortium, the buyout, the 480 acres sitting in Polk County right now with the winter wheat in the ground and the equipment shed locked for the season, and the farmhouse standing in the same place it had stood since before Aldrich built it. She knew what he would have made of it. He would have said it was the ordinary result of doing the next thing, and then the thing after that, and he would have meant it because he was a man who genuinely believed that the work in front of you is the only work there is, and that anything that follows from doing it well is simply what follows. He would have been wrong about the ordinary part, but he would not have been persuaded of that, and so it would not have mattered. Mae Marsh is 24 years old. She is Clara's daughter, born in 2002, named for her great-great-grandmother, in the way that names are recycled in families that pay attention to their own history. She has her mother's focus, and according to Clifton, who met her when she was small and has followed her progress with the interested attention of a man who has been invested in this family's future for nearly 4 decades, something of Aldrich's quality of stillness, the particular stillness of people who have decided what they are going to do and do not need to make noise about it. She studied agricultural engineering at Iowa State, which is not the same program Clara went through, but arrives at the same place from a different angle, the angle of systems and infrastructure and the technological dimension of what farming is becoming and will continue to become. She is finishing her master's degree this spring. Her thesis is on precision soil monitoring systems for mid-scale Midwest operations, which is to say, she has spent 2 years studying in formal academic term exactly the kind of ground her mother farms. She is coming home in the spring. Clara has not said much about this to people outside the family, in the way that she has not said much about important things throughout her life until the time comes to do them. But she has been preparing. She has been thinking about what it means to hand something forward, to be on the giving end of the transmission, that she was on the receiving end of the transmission that runs from Aldrich's hands on this wheel to her hands on this wheel to Mae's hands eventually on this wheel. The equipment shed has space for one more machine. On the morning of January 16th, every year Clara Marsh goes out to the equipment shed before sunrise. She unlocks the door. She walks past the modern tractors, the planter, the grain cart, the tillage equipment that represents 40 years of accumulated working capital. She walks to the far end of the shed where the 1948 John Deere Model B stands, the same machine that stood in this same county on this same date in 1959 when Aldrich Marsh hitched a pump rig to it and drove out onto the ice roads. She climbs into the cab. She puts her hands on the wheel. She turns the key. The engine catches. She lets it warm up, listening to it in the quiet of the January morning. Then she pulls out of the shed and drives slowly in the dark in whatever weather January has decided to provide around the perimeter of the home quarter. 160 acres, the same circuit, the same speed. She does this on November 14th as well every year, the anniversary of the auction, the day she stood in the back of a crowd of 200 men in her grandfather's gloves and held up a paddle that nobody thought belonged in her hands. She does not do it for sentiment exactly, though sentiment is part of it. She does it because there are things that need to be practiced to be kept. The way a community keeps its history by telling it. The way a farmer keeps a piece of ground by working it. The way a debt is honored, not by a single payment, but by the ongoing acknowledgement of what was given and what was received. She drives slowly around the field in the cold and listens to the sound of the engine. It is the same sound that Hollis Crandall heard coming around the bend on January 18th of 1959, standing in his barn doorway in the dark with 8 dairy cattle dying of thirst behind him and no way to help them. The sound that should not have been on the road in those conditions, the sound that was there anyway because Aldrich Marsh had decided it would be there and had made it so. Clara drives and listens. The sound of a diesel engine in the cold morning air, moving steadily, not in a hurry and not stopping. The sound of someone who has looked at what needs doing and is doing it, one farm at a time, and then the next one, and then the one after that with 6 more before lunch and no time to stop. The sound in the dark of a January morning on 320 acres in Polk County, Iowa, that means exactly what it has always meant. Someone is coming to help.